So nice to see such great representation across the world. I saw a few from Akron and Toledo, and actually my hometown is Cleveland. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. So just like if you've been with us in the past, you know that I have used Nearpod. Now, Nearpod does limit the number of participants in there. So you can join if you like, if you want to participate and engage. If you'd rather just sit back and relax and enjoy, no problem, no worries. So if you're going to join with me, you can join at join.nearpod.com, and our code is FERA3. Okay, so I'll again, if you don't want to engage, that's fine. I'll be asking some questions here and there, and you can always put your answers in the chat box. So I'm going to click this box off, but don't worry, that code doesn't go away. So if you haven't joined yet, you can continue to see that code here in the upper left-hand corner. Okay, so FERA3. So as Richard said, today I'm going to be talking about EAP, so English for Academic Purposes and Critical Thinking, and how we can build readiness for academic rigor. So how do we get students ready for what lies ahead, what lies beyond their EAP courses? So let's start out with what are some of the greatest challenges today in EAP teaching? And if you're in Nearpod, go ahead and just post your ideas there. If you're not in Nearpod, I'm keeping my chat box open here as well. So what are some challenges you face in teaching EAP? Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a level. I'm seeing ever-changing norms, conventions, diversity, keeping it interactive, plagiarism, level of students, keeping students interested, thinking in their native language, lack of motivation just popped up in our chat box there, assessment of big groups, academic honesty, cheating and plagiarism seems to be a big one with us today. Mixed levels, the whole idea that students want to be spoon-fed. I love the motivation in all caps there. I saw that as well several times in our chat box. The lack of enthusiasm, laziness, authentic materials, lack of support from rest of faculty, lack of engagement and motivation, critical thinking skills, unemployment after graduation. So all of these things are challenges that we definitely face in the EAP world. And today we'll talk about a couple of these, and many of which you mentioned are definitely part of what I'm going to be focusing on. So when we talk about level, sometimes our students are entering our programs at very, very low levels. And so to get them ready for that academic coursework, they have a lot of skill building to do, usually in a very short period of time. So that level and that low placement, perhaps. And what I like to call boomerang students. So the gap between the EAP courses and our academic courses. So oftentimes we see students coming back into our programs. We've sent them out, and you know, I've gotten that horrible phone call myself which says, did you send this student to us? This student's not quite ready. And so that student might be coming back to us, whether they're coming back to us for class or coming back to us for just some support. And then we have that critical thinking. And that critical thinking goes along with the concept of motivation and students not being able to think outside the box. And, you know, the whole concept, I saw somebody put spoon-fed in there. All of these are challenges that exist for us today when we're thinking about preparing our students for beyond our classes. And for me, it's really a balancing act, right? So students want to, you know, they're motivated to a certain degree to go into their their discipline courses, but many are not ready. And many students have reported difficulties upon entering their academic courses after they leave these little safe havens of our EAP courses. They're also definitely struggling with their peers, you know, being around students who have the same experiences they have, and then going into programs where students are very different and have very vastly different experiences than they have. So it's a real balancing act here. So how can we build this readiness for rigor? Well, think about this for a second. Our students, when they leave our courses, they're asked maybe to sit through a 50-minute lecture, or maybe they need to read a 20-page chapter. Very, very different from what they've experienced in our EAP courses, right? So, you know, before we teach a reading passage, we will most likely activate schema, right? By asking learners what they already know. We might go through vocabulary. We might do some pre-reading, or what you're seeing on the screen, some pre-listening. So we're slowly building students towards that task. Well, this is really different than what they're going to experience in these other courses, okay? So fortunately, we know our students are going to be engaged in our English language reading passages because, you know, we're often presenting them with very high interest reading, like this one on gender differences in language. But again, something very different than what they're going to be experiencing in their EAP course. So I'm sorry, their courses beyond EAP. So, you know, this is a great reading practice, and it can help students build the skills that are going to aid in comprehension. However, it's going to look vastly different from the expectations that they're going to be held to beyond our courses. And so the balance here, students and teachers are both left hanging here. Our textbooks only get us so far, right? And increasingly, students are being placed in EAP and IEP courses to get a crash course, really to prepare for their academic study. But in our courses, we often provide too much scaffolding, right? And students receive a lot of support from the teacher with limited practice in difficult, rigorous content. So, you know, oftentimes we can't find materials that are at the level we need them to be at. Oftentimes we might use developmental texts, but they're not really designed then for language learners, and they don't really help address the challenges our students have. So the balance is about the previous learning. Does it go far enough? Do our courses, our EAP courses, have that rigor that's going to be expected of them beyond? And how about those long lectures? Okay, this is the thing my students come back and talk about again and again and again. You know, they're being expected to sit in a class and take notes for 50 minutes or even 2 hours. So a lot of times we lack some of the authenticity in our programs. Most of our textbooks have lectures that are less than 5 minutes, right? And sometimes our content is too structured. So students then leave us and they feel overwhelmed, right? They're overwhelmed by the academic challenges. They're over-challenged, right, by the complex content, okay? They're unprepared. They're unprepared to be autonomous learners many times. And then there's this isolated learning and studying in classes that are comprised of entirely mostly native speakers, right? So they feel very isolated, very different from their EAP or IEP experiences, okay? And then they also may feel unsupported, okay? I think the greatest thing, you know, one of the greatest things we do is we really support our students. But then what happens when they leave us, right? What happens when they leave us? They don't receive that same kind of support. So how can we build this readiness? How can we build this readiness? Well, we're going to talk about filling the gaps, filling those gaps, building a bridge between what we do in EAP and what we do in our academic coursework. Okay, and I see a lot of chat about the EAP and IEP. And let me just be really clear. EAP is English for academic purposes, and IEP is Intensive English Program. So many times it's EAPs and IEPs that are preparing students for an English academic coursework, meaning that they're going to maybe study for their post-secondary in English. So IEP and EAP. So we want to fill these gaps. Content, so thinking about the academic content. And then we have vocabulary. Okay, some of my best students I sent on into courses, whether it's engineering or biology or mathematics or business. We send them on, and these are some of our best students, but oftentimes there's a gap between the vocabulary that they learn in their EAP courses and the vocabulary that they're going to be hearing about in their business courses. Then we also have that cultural and affective gap, which is a social gap. Okay, all of these really involve developing and sustaining their critical thinking skills. So over the last 2 months, we've talked so much about critical thinking, and I've said quite a few times that critical thinking has to be built from the very early levels. We have to build that foundation early on. So gap number 1 is our linguistic gap. So this might refer to some content language, right? So do they have the language they need to be successful in those academic courses? How about that informal peer-to-peer language? So, we spend a lot of time working on what we like to call academic English, or I sometimes tell my students book English. But do we spend any time working on that informal peer-to-peer language? Okay, in the US and other Western countries, it is very common for students to have to work in groups, right? It's very common for them to have to do partner work or peer work. And so they have to be able to understand the register of their peers versus the register of the book language. Then we have the speed and accent of the professor or lecturer. Our students get very used to our voices, okay? And we're trained in phonology, so we're very conscious of our speech. That doesn't always happen when they leave our programs. And here in the US, I'm in Florida, it's a very diverse place where students are then exposed to accents from all over the world as in their academic courses. Then we also have that linguistic gap of inferences and drawing conclusions, and that's really our critical thinking there, right? So have we prepared them well enough to make inferences and draw conclusions? Because that's what happens a lot in our academic courses. Next, we have expectations from professors and peers, and the professors themselves, and the amount of work they get. It's funny to me because my students in my EAP courses think that I give a lot of homework, right? Until they actually go into an academic discipline. And then they are overwhelmed by the amount of work that they have to do. What do they have to do to prepare themselves to sit in that 50-minute lecture? What do they do when they have to read 50 pages? Okay, and so again, this academic gap. And then we have that social gap, right? And I've talked about this a little bit, but just to break it down a little bit more, when they're doing peer work, there is definitely a different register as far as linguistics are concerned, right? The linguistic element. But how about those affective domains, those, real cultural pieces? How to engage in a group? How do you jump into that group work? How do you negotiate with your peers, your ideas? How do you assert your ideas into that group? How do you break into that conversation? So again, all these pieces really playing together. So let's talk about some effective practices for filling those gaps. I don't think any of us would disagree that those gaps exist for many of our students. So how can we fill those gaps? So I'm going to take you through 4 effective practices. Our first effective practice is building deep conceptual knowledge of vocabulary rather than label knowledge. And it's really about building the critical thinking in with the vocabulary. Okay, so let me explain what I mean here. Label knowledge is when we might have a word and a definition, and students are matching those, right? Conceptual knowledge is truly deeply understanding the words. So I have a question for you, and you can put this in the chat box if you're not in Nearpod. If you're in Nearpod, drop it in the Nearpod collaborative board for me. In your words, what does it mean to really know a word? What does it mean to really know a word? So I'll be quiet for a minute here and let's see what your ideas are. So I'm seeing a lot about context, about using it correctly. I'm seeing understanding all the forms of the word. I'm even seeing collocations, able to use the word in writing and speaking, contextualizing. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat box, knowing the context, the collocations, being able to explain it to others, using it in writing and speaking, using all forms effectively, being able to switch forms, all aspects of word knowledge, being able to use it in context. Context, I see context a lot, okay? You have to know the meaning, the spell of, the connotative and the denotative meaning, register, collocations, okay? Synonyms, internalizing it, paraphrasing it, phonology, okay? And you're all right, okay? We need to know all of these things to really know a word. So we need to know its spoken form. We need to know how it sounds, right? Where the word stress is. We need to know the written form. We need to know the parts of the word which have meaning. We need to know the form and meaning of the word. We need to know the concepts associated with that word. We need to know vocabulary that's associated with that word. We need to know its grammatical function, okay? We need to know its collocations. We also need to know its register and frequency. And this all comes from Paul Nation's work in vocabulary. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Paul Nation, but he came up with these 9 pieces. So if we know these 9 pieces, then we know a word. So think about this for a second. How many of these pieces do we really work on in our courses? Okay, our students know how to say it, they know the written form, they usually know the grammatical function, they may know some forms and meaning, but do we really focus on all of these when we talk about vocabulary? So for intentional learning, based on what it really means to know a word, a student needs a wide variety of activities that build and utilize their critical thinking skills when it comes to vocabulary, okay? And there's lots of things we can do to build our vocabulary and fill that linguistic gap. So a higher level of engagement, the easier the learning task is viewed, which, so if you have very engaging vocabulary activities, students tend to view those tasks as easy, okay? So I like to say the breadth and depth of vocabulary plus the variety of activities that develop and foster critical thinking, plus engagement equals increased learning when we talk about vocabulary development. And so we're really talking about making sure that we first introduce the words, then we reinforce it, and then we move to independent production. So thinking about those things we've talked about for so long with Bloom's cognitive domains, making sure that we're applying it to vocabulary as well. Okay, so breadth and depth of vocabulary, variety, engagement, and increased learning. Okay, so take a look at this passage here, and I've highlighted a few words: mixed and community. And if we look at the word mixed, it actually appears 4 times, right? And with each exposure, students can develop a working knowledge of the term beyond its literal meaning. Okay, so oftentimes when we're engaging students in learning vocabulary, we're looking at the word in one context. Okay, we're looking at it in one context. And so here they see it in 4 different contexts, So 3 of the 4 times it appears with the word community. Okay, so if we develop students critical thinking, they can let us know that this is a collocation, right? It's going to be a collocation. So once again, students can gain a great deal of information about the word beyond its definition when we look at it multiple times within a passage. They see the concepts associated with the word. They see it's part of speech, the collocations, the knowledge of form and meaning. And the same thing is happening to community, right? Not only are we asking students to look at this in context, but what's happening then is they're making connections and they're drawing conclusions. So we know from our last couple weeks here that that means they're building their critical thinking skills. Okay, so next, how about this one? We've talked a lot about strategies for building critical thinking. Here is one of those maps. Okay, here's one of those maps. And getting students at early level to see connections between words. So here's the word building, right? And now we can use a vocabulary map. Okay, so we have skyscrapers, we have houses, we have low rise, we have barns, we have circular. Okay. And another example here. Okay, getting students to apply it in real terms. I'm seeing that we might have trouble seeing the font, so I think that might be in Nearpod, but I will make sure that I share the slides afterwards as well. And I'm going to tell you all these examples are from University Success. Okay, so that's a textbook series that I worked on where we did a lot with vocabulary development and critical thinking. So here you can see students really have to apply the terms, real application. They're going to be describing a building, but not only are we going to look at the kind of building, we're looking at its function, its parts, its characteristics. So again, drawing connections, making connections. Okay, so I can't say enough about vocabulary development. I cannot say enough about vocabulary development. For me, everything in language is built off of vocabulary. And so the more energy that we put into vocabulary instruction, I feel like it's going to be better for our students, okay, in the long run. So vocabulary, everything is connected to vocabulary. So let's talk about those academic skills. And sometimes these get overlooked, okay? So the second effective practice here is allowing the academic content to be the vehicle for language instruction. Now we might say, oh yeah, well, of course we always do this. You might be using a theme-based textbook, but are we allowing that content to be a vehicle, or are we letting that content drive what we do? Okay, so let me clarify a little bit. We want the we want the content to work for us. We don't want to work for the content, right? So we want to make sure that we leverage that content. So really providing, motivating, challenging content, it engages our learners and it makes the language really very real for them, very authentic. And when the content of an academic discipline is integrated purposefully in our low-level language courses, students can build those academic skills and develop those critical thinking skills alongside their language skills. Okay, so purposeful. So what do I mean by purposeful? Well, those academic gaps in content can be more motivating for our EAP learners. So let's unpack that for a second. So many of our students come to us and they don't want to take their English language courses. They want their academic content. And so when we present the language through academic content, it becomes more motivating for those students and can help fill those gaps because we know the link between motivation and language learning. Learners also develop wider knowledge and critical thinking. It becomes a much easier vehicle for students to develop critical thinking. And it supports their educational and academic needs. So it teaches students to develop valuable study skills such as note-taking, summarizing, extracting key information from a text, all very, very critical for their success. So it's important to understand that language is the goal, though. I don't want to lose sight of that. The content is only allows us to deliver language in an authentic, meaningful, real world way. Okay, so that's always going to be our goal. A third effective practice is to build instructional tasks and learning around developing critical thinking skills. And obviously, this has been the crux of our sessions the last 2 months, right? So we always have to keep critical thinking in our rear view mirror, right? Or in our front view mirror, I should say, right? We always have to build instructional tasks and learning around critical thinking. Now, if you were with me a couple weeks ago, we talked about different strategies. So things like finding the problem, okay? So providing students with a short reading, but building it into their language lesson. So this is very simple past tense lesson. While I'm teaching past tense, I'm also building critical thinking by asking students, what's the problem? What happened to Thomas? Why do you think Thomas was late? What's going to happen next to Thomas? Okay, so again, language alongside critical thinking. And here, what's the rule? Again, getting students to notice. Here we're reading about the Jamestown settlement, right? So building that history. But at the same time, students could say, oh, wow, this is past tense and I see ED. Okay, so we know when we work harder to learn something, we remember it. When it's handed to us, we don't remember it. So getting students to work hard and notice those ED endings can help fill that academic gap and prepare them for, again, what lies ahead. I also firmly believe in project-based, task-based, problem-based learning because I think it is very authentic for what our students are going to be doing, right? So, a project-based learning or a problem-based learning would begin with a challenge or a problem, and students are going to explore it over a period of time, okay? A period of time. And what's also happening there is we're also building some social skills because they're going to have to be working together, right? And so we can focus on those 21st century skills of communication and collaboration and creativity and critical thinking. And the same is true of task-based learning. So these are going to really replicate what students are going to be asked to do beyond our EAP programs. So how about those social gaps now, okay? And we know, we talked about the linguistic, and I failed to mention too much about register, but there are lots of things that we can do to build a student's understanding of the registers, the peer registers and the professor registers. And this can come in play with also building those social gaps. So the effective practice number 4 is to foster an environment where academic skills, affective and cultural, can be built alongside, right? So, I want still my students to be sensitive to the register, but I also want them to understand the cultural expectations of doing group work, the cultural expectations of how we interrupt or how we share our ideas. Okay. And so when we think about this, we think about those affective domains. Okay. So they start with receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, and internalizing values. So this is all about, can I listen and respond? So when my partners are talking, am I able to listen and respond? Can I negotiate with them? Okay, do I have not only the language, but the cultural knowledge of how we negotiate and when it's appropriate to negotiate? How about participating? Okay, how do I take responsibility for something in the group that we're going to be working on? And how can I show self-reliance? Okay, so all of these things need to be built alongside those linguistic and academic goals as well. Now, we've talked about this a bit, but we really need to explicitly teach these things. And again, this is an example of from university success. Even early on, explicitly teaching students how to become an active participant. What does it mean to be an active participant? Okay, and I see some chat going on in the box, and I do this as well. I see somebody said they can assign the roles, right? And that's something you want to do. Okay, you're going to be the student who introduces an idea. You're going to be the student who interrupts. You're going to be the student who asks for elaboration, right? And you're going to be the student to ask somebody to elaborate. Okay, so all of these things have to be explicitly taught, and we have to create opportunities in the classroom for students to do that. So, explicitly teaching elaboration is teaching them the language of elaboration. So you mentioned why, okay? You mentioned how. When you said or mentioned, did you mean? Okay, I tell my students you're not allowed to say, could you repeat that please? Could you repeat that please? We're not allowed to use those phrases in the classroom, but we use these types of phrases, right? So explicitly teaching the language that's going to be accepted of students beyond our EAP courses, okay? So when a student's sitting in a lecture and the lecture's 50 minutes, they can't ask the professor to repeat it, right? They can ask the professor, though, when you said there was another war going on, did you mean a war within the country, like the war on poverty? Okay, so teaching them, explicitly teaching them, building language, building academic skills, and building social skills. Here's another example, and we're guilty of this a lot, I think, in IEPs and EAPs, because we always ask students to work with a partner, right? We're very big on partner activities. But have we prepared them to work with a partner? Okay. Have we adequately prepared them to work with a partner? Do they know what the expectation is? So we have to explicitly teach this. So giving them sentence framers in the beginning is very helpful for giving peer feedback. Okay, getting them to understand why we give peer feedback. So explicit teaching. Excuse me. The same is for, on the left, you'll see inferences. So explicitly teaching students how to make inferences. Look at your notes. Think about what you know about that topic. Put those two pieces together and make an inference. Make an inference. Okay. Explicit teaching of these academic skills. And so, to kind of put it all together, when we're building readiness for rigor, we have to realize that our students struggle for success because we may not always think in terms of building all of these areas for their level, right? We don't think about building all of these levels. We think about building their language. But we really want to prepare students to be successful in all aspects of their academic career. So we want to make sure our students succeed. So in the experience of many teachers who prepare students for academic studies, as we saw earlier, we're all well aware of what these challenges are. We know students need to understand a wide range of demanding longer texts. We know that they need to recognize implicit meaning. They have to be able to express themselves fluently and spontaneously, right? Without searching, for the language that they may need. They have to use language flexibly and effectively for social, academic, professional purposes. They have to be able to produce clear, well-structured writings, right? They have to show control of organizational patterns. Um, and they have to demonstrate critical thinking, which all of these do. And so when you're building readiness for rigor, you have to make sure that you're building those linguistic skills, those academic skills, those social skills, all the while building those critical thinking skills. So I've seen lots of chat, but what I'd love to know is your takeaways. Now, if you've been with me for the last 8 weeks, before we go into questions, I would love to see takeaways you have from the whole series, or if you were only with me today, that's fine as well. But what are your takeaways? And again, if you're not in Nearpod, feel free to put it in the chat box as well. So some takeaways. What are we going to take away from whether it's the series of critical thinking or today's session for building readiness? So I see reinforcement of your ideas, instincts, and practices. And I love it. I think we all know what to do. A lot of times it's juggling, right? Juggling, making sure we're meeting the standards, making sure we're meeting our SLOs. Okay. It is challenging. It gets you to rethink. Students need to interact with language in a variety of ways. A new thinking paradigm, contextualizing. I love that. A balance between skills, language, and content. Okay. The importance of critical thinking and how to implement it and be explicit. Yeah, I hope that's a big takeaway that we all have. And I see we have a few with the explicit instruction. It has to be explicit. It has to be thoughtfully designed. And so that we build these in. A lot of times we get so caught up in focusing on just the language piece. And Ishan, I see here, going beyond that one piece of language. We want to educate the whole student, okay? Not just the linguistic element, okay? And could you please repeat is very powerful. Yes, my students, we have a whole list of words we're not allowed to use in the classroom, like good, nice, and interesting, and bad, because they're very vague terms. But we're also not allowed to say, can you repeat? Okay, so we have to really think about building this into every piece that we have. So I'm seeing lots of great takeaways here and really teaching explicitly. Oh, love this image here with critical thinking. Okay, so we have some time here for questions, comments, final thoughts, and I'm going to hand it back over to Richard. I don't know if we have questions here.
a word that you have to look at. And one of the questions there was, how can you manage time in class to give enough emphasis to this process while still covering the contents of the course?
It's a fantastic question. So a lot of times I use a flipped model. Okay. So, like when we're getting students to just, memorize and do what I call drill and kill kinds of vocabulary exercises, those are things that can easily be done at home, right? So getting students to go through, those drill and kill kind of memorization practices at home. And then when we come into the classroom, really vocabulary then becomes about looking at how it occurs, looking at the words that it occurs next to. All of these kinds of things that are higher on Bloom's taxonomy that require a little deeper critical thinking, those things can be worked on in the classroom, while those more drill and kill kinds of activities that require less teacher facilitation can be worked on outside of the classroom.
Okay, thank you. We've had a couple of questions actually along the same lines. One was, do you have any bibliographical recommendations of how to implement these? Another one was, do you have any websites that you recommend about implementation of what you're talking about here in the process?
Oh, great questions. I did a session right before COVID it was all on vocabulary instruction and how different strategies that you can use in the classroom to build each of those 9 vocabulary descriptors, right? So you can find that slideshow on slideshare.net. So if anybody's familiar with slideshare.net, you can put in my name and you'll be able to see that presentation. And again, it goes through several classroom activities and strategies to build the vocabulary. I also suggest looking up Paul Nation, Nation. He is the man who came, slideshare.net. I see a question there. That's it. He is the man who actually came up with those 9 criteria. So, just do a little Google search on Paul and you'd probably find lots of great resources as well.
Yeah, thank you. One was, I guess, perhaps similar to what you mentioned previously, is how can we manage to make time for critical thinking? This question says, I think it's discouraged. Our programs want memorization and language skills transfer, not inviting sincere, honest questions that matter.
Right. And I think that's a challenge that we all face, right? Because we have certain standards we have to meet. We have certain measures we always have to document, right? But I strongly feel that we can, if we focus on explicit teaching of critical thinking, we're also at the same time focusing on explicit language teaching, right? It's just instead of putting always the language as the focus, I think the critical thinking can sometimes be set as the focus, and then it lends itself to that language teaching. And at the very simplest level, that passage about Tomas, that's a level 1 passage, right? Where we're, Thomas has this problem, he's late for class, but just getting students to think about, well, why was he late? And what's going to happen next? What might the penalties be? All of those kinds of little activities. That one was teaching past tense, but at the same time, it was building, some critical thinking skills.
Thank you. I think there's been one more question, which was looking more deeply into EAP. I would like to know which EAP framework you apply, i.e. which EAP theoretical framework do you implement?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by framework. The program I teach in follows, the SEFRA, the Common European for leveling. But as far as framework, I'm not exactly sure. Are we thinking like methodology there or approach, language teaching approach?
I'm afraid that's not clear in the in the chat. But it looks like, and there are lots of comments, but I think questions that we seem to be running out of questions. So with that, I think I'll thank you, Christine, so much for taking us, well, today through building academic readiness, but also through the whole last 3 webinars over the last 2 months. It's been great myself listening to this. And so thank you very much for taking us on this journey. And thank you also to everybody else here who's been attending today and in previous webinars as well. A couple of questions have come up about certificates and the recording. The certificate will be sent out to the email address you used to register for this webinar, and the recording will be posted on english.com/experiences. So with that, thank you so much, Christina, and I think we'll leave it there.
Thank you.